Fire weapons, one of the most satisfying ways to deal with the enemies of Super Earth.
That is a mess down there.
Since the September update, fire weapons have received a significant buff in both their damage over time and their effectiveness against heavily armored enemies, making them a really good all-around weapon, especially against the Terminids. However, there's still a major drawback to using these weapons, making it difficult to bring a fire-focused build, and that's because of their lack of knockback and stun effects. So basically, you have a difficult time keeping the enemy in the area of fire to really maximize that damage over time. This of course leads to getting run over by chargers, jumped by hunters, and being vulnerable to spitters. You could try to counter this weakness by bringing stun grenades or an EMS mortar sentry, but that is one less damage dealing stratagem for your fire build, and using stun grenades on every enemy won't work for prolonged combat. But thanks to the chemical agent War Bond, we now have another controlling effect in the game through gas weapons. They now inflict confusion on the enemies, which means when applied, they're more likely to wander around in the fire you create rather than charge straight after you. And that's where the Sterilizer comes in. Unlike the orbital gas strike and dog breath, the Sterilizer allows you to apply that confusion effect with precision and then able to quickly switch back over to your fire weapon so you can continue to light the torches of liberty. I had a ton of fun using the Sterilizer this way, and I gotta say, the results speak for themselves.
Jeez. Yeah, gas fire. I gotta hurry up and unlock the gas.
So, if that interests you, this is how you get good with the Sterilizer. Of all the loadout combinations I tried, using the Sterilizer this way, this is what I found to be most effective. Now, you're going to need to bring that guard dog, the regular one. I'll tell you why here in a second, but it's been upgraded recently, so it's actually fantastic. Then you're also going to need to bring that napalm airstrike. It's a key backbone to this build. And since we don't have any anti-large, that orbital rail cannon strike is going to really help us balance our build. You're going to get a lot of use out of that primary flamethrower, and then of course we need to be able to close up some bug holes, so we got that grenade pistol, and then thermite grenades are going to be our primary way of countering large units, and because of that, we want to bring armor that allows us to carry more grenades. You don't need the gas or fire protective armor for this build. It really gets a little messy, but not messy enough to where you're going to end up taking yourself out with those two damage over time effects. With the loadout out of the way, let's talk about the Sterilizer itself, because if you were like me, the first time you pick this thing up, you probably tried to use it like a flamethrower. But with a flamethrower, you have that initial damage you're doing from the stream of fire itself, and it's very good. And then it's also applying that fire status effect, which does a pretty good amount of damage over time. The gas weapons and the Sterilizer specifically, that stream of gas coming out doesn't seem to be really doing any additional damage. All you're doing is applying that caustic status effect and a mild damage over time when compared to fire. But I think this is a feature, not a bug. The reason for that is that if the caustic weapons did just as much damage as the fire weapons, then why would you ever use your fire weapons? If you could do all the same damage and apply that confusion, you would never use anything but these gas weapons. This of course begs the question, if all it's really good for is applying confusion, why not just spend your time doing damage to the enemy instead of trying to confuse it? The answer to that is that you use it to maximize the damage from your fire, turret, and guard dog sources. The Sterilizer is the most efficient gas weapon at applying that confusion effect on exactly the enemies that you want, and then switching immediately back over to your primary to continue doing damage. Since the Sterilizer doesn't have any primer to it, you can immediately use the weapon as soon as you switch to it, and it doesn't take much spray at all in order to actually inflict that confusion on the enemy, and you go right back to your primary weapon. And if that primary weapon is a flamethrower, the enemy is going to spend more time wandering around in the fire that you've created and less time pushing you around. That's the overall concept that we're working with. Now I have some great tips and tricks for you guys to set you up for success where I had to learn the hard way. But if you're enjoying this video and you want to see more content like it, why not flex your love for democracy by hitting that like and subscribe? We'd love to have you on board. Alright, tip number 1. Just because you got the enemy confused doesn't mean they're safe to be near. When they're confused, they seem to want to target something at random. That could be the air, a rock, that could be a fellow Terminid next to them, and sometimes they just zone out completely. But if you're close to them, there is a chance that they'll still target you, which kind of defeats the purpose of everything. So you want to give yourself some distance because you're basically guaranteed they'll target anything but you at that point. For reference, check out the distance I was able to poison these targets. The reach of the spray is a bit deceptive here because the visual doesn't seem to really telegraph the actual range for which you can apply that caustic status effect. Now this is great because it gives you more time to prime that flamethrower whenever you switch over to it, and it also gives the enemy a couple seconds to engage in that confused behavior while you're still out of range from being targeted. Now this strategy works great while you're running and gunning, switching between the sterilizer and the flamethrower, but when bug holes start appearing and things start getting crazy, that's when you want to start bringing out the napalm airstrike. Creating fire lines like this can stop entire hordes of enemies, especially as you're sterilizing the ones that are in that fire, keeping them in there, and they just start to melt because now they have the fire and the caustic damage over time applied to them, and they're meandering around not charging through at you, which is generally the problem with the napalm airstrike. As you can see, when it's paired with the sterilizer, it turns it into a whole different beast. Now there are two enemy types this will not work against, and that's going to be the Bile Titan and Impaler. They are immune to confusion, so using the sterilizer against them is completely pointless. That's exactly why we're bringing the Orbital Rail Cannon Strike. That's going to give us an immediate response to these enemy types so that we're not helpless. Chargers, however, are susceptible to confusion, and it's very noticeable. With just a quick spray, these chargers become very disoriented, just meandering on the battlefield. What's funny is that they're designed to charge at you, break up your team, and disrupt your ranks, and instead, you can actually have them do that to themselves. If they're already charging you, the sterilizer still comes in clutch because the charger will turn away from you, both exposing them to a thermite grenade and keeping them away from you long enough for it to explode at a safe distance. If you've ever used thermite grenades against chargers before, you've probably had this experience more than once where the charger has a thermite grenade on him, it's live, he runs you down, and when it explodes, he takes you out with him. The sterilizer prevents this situation from happening, making the thermite grenade a much more reliable counter against the charger.
Alright, you done?
There's one last thing that's going to make or break your entire experience with this build, and that's how you manage to deal with hunters. Since your weapons don't have any kind of immediate knockback or stun effect on the enemies, and hunters are really good at getting right on top of you out of nowhere, you have to rely heavily on the guard dog that you bring in order to mitigate this threat. In this clip, I brought Dog Breath, and my experience with this is that yes, it helps apply more confusion on the enemies, but it doesn't do enough damage to really help counter a swarm of hunters. Guard Dog Rover, on the other hand, does do a good amount of damage, but unfortunately this laser beam has become a bit of a double-edged sword in this game. I find myself running from it just as much as I'm running from the enemy, and it's controlling my movement in these situations where I'd rather just be able to go where I want to go. And although in this clip, kiting the enemy like this is working out really well, there's a lot of situations where yeah, it completely backfires. The goal is to have something that can counter little enemies that get right on top of us. Look how well the guard dog does this job of countering these little enemies with speed and efficiency. This right here was the last piece of the puzzle for me. So once I used the guard dog over everything else, and I used the rest of this build of course, I was able to counter hunters, chargers, pretty much anything that came my way, and I was having an absolute blast. I've been playing this game since launch, and there are certain builds that give you a unique experience of joy, and I gotta say, standing at the edge of a field of fire and controlling all the enemies beyond it with a tool like the sterilizer, there's really nothing quite like it. And I gotta say, I felt so much in control of the situation, I was having so much fun, I didn't even realize that my entire team left me on a super hell dive mission to deal with this bug hole breach by myself. So this build definitely works if you're by yourself, or if you like to go and scout, or be away from your team for any reason. I do it all the time to collect samples, so if you're that guy, this is definitely going to work for you. But there's actually a cooperative strategy that you can use with this build that is even more fun than this. Find someone who has a flamethrower, work with them closely on the front lines, and the build works incredibly well. You're just going to boost their experience. The enemy's going to be very confused. They're going to have a lot more time frying those enemies with that flamethrower, and you are going to have a much easier time keeping the fire on those enemies, keeping them suppressed. There really is not a whole lot that could punch through two people working together like this. Not only is this an efficient thing to do, but this is peak Helldiver type of fun. Check it out for yourself.
Ooh, that was close.
And there it is, the Sterilizer by itself, not very good, but when you have the right equipment, you have the right tactics and strategies, it unlocks one of the funnest builds I've played so far. So next time you're on the tournament front and you want to try something new, why not dust off that Sterilizer and get good.